I found the tent at 1400 hours on a Tuesday in July, half buried under snow that had fallen the night before. The stove chimney gave it away, a thin column of metal poking through the white like a periscope. I'd been running the northern patrol loop, checking huts and emergency shelters after the cold front pushed through. The snow wasn't forecast to stick this early in the season, but the high country makes its own rules. I parked the patrol ute at the clearing edge and walked the last 50 meters on foot. The tent sat in a natural depression below the tree line, wedged between two snow gums that had probably been saplings when I was born. Modern dome design, alpine grade, the kind that costs serious money. Someone had staked it down properly, guy lines tight and even. I called out twice before I got close. No answer, just the wind moving through the branches overhead. The snow around the site showed no tracks except my own, which didn't sit right. A storm dumps 30 centimeters overnight, and not a single mark leads away from a occupied camp. I stopped 3 meters back and called again, louder this time. Still nothing. The tent's entrance faced south, away from the prevailing wind. Smart placement. I could see the vestibule zipper was closed but not locked, the fabric moving slightly with air pressure from inside. That's when I noticed the warmth. Not much, but enough to melt the snow in a half-meter circle around the base. The chimney wasn't smoking, but when I crouched down and held my hand near the vent, I felt heat rising. Someone had been burning a fire inside within the last hour, maybe less. I keyed my radio and raised Alice at the station office. Told her I had a occupied tent at grid reference 473821, no visible occupant, no tracks, stove still warm. She came back asking if I'd checked inside yet. I said negative, waiting on protocol. She told me to hold position and went off channel to run the site through the permit database. I spent the next 5 minutes walking the perimeter, looking for any sign of movement. The snow gums stood quiet. No gear outside, no food bags hung, no makeshift latrine area that I could spot. Just the tent and the circle of bare ground where the warmth had pushed the snow back. Alice's voice crackled through static when she returned. She asked me to confirm the grid reference, and I read it back digit by digit. Then she went quiet for a beat too long. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted. She said the permit tied to that site was issued to a Michael James Garrett, logged for a solo winter trek, entry dated 15th of July. I waited. She said July 15th, 11 years ago. I looked at the tent again, at the clean lines of the fabric and the taut guy ropes. Asked her to repeat. She did, slower this time. Said Garrett was declared missing 23 days after he logged in. Search called off after 2 weeks of heavy snow and zero trace. File stayed open for another year, then moved to presumed deceased. I asked if anyone had pulled a permit for this grid this season. She said negative, not for 6 months. I told her the tent looked new, or near enough. She told me to secure the site and wait for police. Said she'd contact the sergeant at Jindabyne and get someone up the mountain. I asked how long. She said 3 hours minimum, maybe 4 if the road past Threadbow was still rough. I said copy and signed off. The wind picked up while I waited, pushing loose snow across the clearing in thin white streams. I pulled my jacket tighter and moved closer to the tent. The fabric was intact, no tears or patches, zippers working smooth when I tested them without opening. I circled around to the back and found a small vent window, mesh screen still in place. Through it, I could see the dim outline of gear inside, a sleeping bag, a pack, something that looked like a camp stove on a flat stone base. No movement, no sound. I called out one more time, loud enough that anyone inside would have no excuse. Nothing came back. The sun was already dropping toward the western ridge, maybe 2 hours of good light left. I went back to the ute and grabbed my incident kit, camera, evidence bags, notebook, spare torch. Protocol said don't enter without backup, but protocol also said secure the scene. I took photos from 6 angles, wide shots of the site, and close frames of the tent and surrounding snow. The camera's metadata would timestamp everything, coordinates baked into each file. I walked a grid pattern around the clearing, looking for anything the snow might have covered. Found nothing. No boot prints, no ski tracks, no sign anyone had approached or left in the last 12 hours. The only marks in the snow were mine and the shallow depressions where the wind had carved channels between the trees. I knelt by the tent entrance and listened. No breathing, no rustling fabric, no hiss of a stove flame, just the wind and the creak of branches overhead. I touched the canvas near the door. Still warm. Not hot, but warmer than it had any right to be. I checked my watch. 1500 hours. Sun already painting long shadows across the clearing. Alice radioed to say the sergeant was en route. ETA 1730. I acknowledged and asked if she'd pulled Garrett's file. She said, affirmative, reading now. I asked what kind of gear he'd carried. She paused, then said the report listed a yellow dome tent, MSR Alpine model, gray pack, blue sleeping bag rated to -15. I looked at the tent in front of me, yellow fabric, MSR logo still visible near the door vent. I keyed the radio and told her. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice had gone flat. She said the report also noted Garrett was an experienced alpinist, 28 years old, fit and well prepared. Said the search team found no evidence of injury or misadventure. Said he'd simply vanished, tent and all. I asked if they'd checked this grid during the search. She said, affirmative, multiple times. I told her the tent was here now. She said copy, and to wait for the sergeant. The temperature dropped as the sun slipped lower. I went back to the ute and fired up the engine, let it idle for warmth while I filled out the incident log. Time of discovery, grid reference, weather conditions, observations. I wrote it all down in block letters, the way they'd taught us in training. When I looked up, the shadows had stretched across the clearing, and the tent sat half in darkness. The stove chimney caught the last of the light, a bright line against the snow. I killed the engine and grabbed my torch. The sergeant wouldn't reach me before dusk, and I wasn't spending the night wondering what was inside that tent. I walked back across the clearing, my breath fogging in the cold. The wind had died down, leaving everything still. I stopped at the entrance and called out one last time. No answer. I reached for the zipper and pulled it down in one smooth motion. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet. The vestibule opened onto darkness, and I clicked the torch on, shining it inside. The beam cut through the dark and landed on a sleeping bag, neatly rolled and strapped at the foot of a ground sheet. A small camp stove sat beside it, the kind that runs on white gas, valve closed and canister disconnected. 2 water bottles stood upright against the tent wall, both full. A pack leaned in the corner, gray canvas with leather straps, the kind you don't see much anymore. Everything was arranged with care, the way someone would leave a site if they planned to come back within the hour. I swept the torch across the rest of the space. A pair of boots sat just inside the entrance, laces tucked in, soles crusted with old mud and pine needles. A down jacket hung from a cord strung between the tent poles, still puffy, still dry. On the ground sheet near the sleeping bag sat a tin mug, empty, and beside it, a small journal, with a pen clipped to the cover. No food wrappers, no mess, no sign of struggle or panic. I stepped back and played the torch over the outside of the tent again, checking the guy lines and stakes. Everything secure, everything taut. The snow around the tent was smooth except for my own boot prints and the disturbed patch where I'd first approached. I walked a slow circle around the clearing, scanning for tracks leading away. The snow cover was thin in places, exposing rock and dead grass, but where it lay deep enough to hold a print, there was nothing. Just the single set of tracks leading in from the direction I'd come. I stopped at the far edge of the clearing and looked back. The tent sat in the center, ghostly in the fading light, the stove chimney a dark line against the yellow fabric. I keyed the radio and told Alice what I'd found. She asked if I'd touched anything inside. I said negative, visual inspection only. She said good, and to keep it that way until the sergeant arrived. I asked if she'd finished reading Garrett's file. She said affirmative, asked what I wanted to know. I asked if the report mentioned what he'd been carrying for food. She paused, papers rustling in the background, then said freeze-dried meals, tea bags, sugar, powdered milk, chocolate bars. I asked if there was a list of personal items. She said the family had provided one during the search: journal, camera, compass, headlamp, pocket knife, wedding ring. I asked about the ring. She said he'd taken it off before the hike, left it with his wife, told her he didn't want to risk losing it. I stared at the tent and asked if anyone had considered he might have staged a disappearance. Alice went quiet for a moment, then said the police had looked into it, found no motive, no financial trouble, no issues at home. Said his wife had been pregnant at the time, said he'd been excited about becoming a father. I said copy, and signed off. The air was getting colder, that sharp edge that comes when the sun drops behind the ridge. I walked back to the tent and crouched beside the entrance, shining the torch inside again without touching anything. The journal sat exactly where I'd seen it before, covered dark with age, pages swollen from moisture. I could see writing on the visible page, neat script in blue ink. I leaned closer, trying to read it without entering the tent. The top line was a date, July 2nd, but no year. Below it, a single paragraph. Weather holding but cold front moving in from the south, summit attempt tomorrow if conditions allow. Saw another hiker near the tree line this afternoon, first person I've seen in 4 days. He didn't respond when I called out, just kept walking west. Strange, there's no trail that way, just scree and deadfall. Considered following to make sure he was all right, but he was moving fast, and the light was fading. We'll check the route tomorrow. I sat back on my heels and played the torch around the tent again. The sleeping bag was rated to -15, Alice had said. The one in front of me had a red compression sack, with a manufacturer's tag still attached. I could just make out the rating printed on the tag, -10. Different bag. I stood and walked to the ute, grabbed my camera from the glove box and came back. Documenting a scene wasn't protocol for a ranger, but something told me I'd want a record of this before the police arrived, and everything got bagged and catalogued. I shot the tent from 4 angles, wide frames that showed its position in the clearing. Then I moved in close, photographing the entrance, the stove chimney, the guy lines and stakes. I crouched and took shots of my boot prints and the undisturbed snow beyond. Finally I leaned into the vestibule and photographed the interior, the flash throwing hard shadows across the gear. The camera's preview screen showed everything in cold detail: the pack, the boots, the journal, the sleeping bag. I zoomed in on the journal page and took 3 more shots, making sure the text was legible. When I lowered the camera, the tent felt different, heavier somehow, as if the act of documenting it had made it more real. I backed out and zipped the entrance closed. The wind picked up, shaking the branches and sending a fresh scatter of snow across the clearing. I checked my watch. 16:20. Still over an hour until the sergeant arrived, longer if the road was slow. I walked back to the ute and climbed inside, leaving the door open so I could hear if anything changed. The heater blew lukewarm air, while I flipped through the photos on the camera's screen. Everything looked exactly as I'd seen it. Tent, gear, journal. But in the photos something else stood out. The boots. In every shot where they were visible, the soles faced the camera, treads thick with dried mud. I zoomed in on one of the close-up frames. The tread pattern was deep, aggressive, the kind you'd see on serious alpine boots. And pressed into the mud, clear as anything, were small stones and bits of vegetation. Not snow. Not ice. Mud and grass, the kind you'd pick up walking across wet ground in late spring or summer. I looked at the tent through the windscreen. The snow around it was fresh, maybe a week old, maybe less. The forecast had been clear until 3 days ago, when the front moved in and dumped 30 centimeters across the high country. If Garrett had been here a week ago, his boots would have been covered in snow, not mud. I set the camera on the passenger seat and keyed the radio. Alice answered immediately. I asked what season Garrett had gone missing. She said winter, late July 11 years ago. I asked if the file mentioned what the weather had been like. She said clear and cold, no snow in the forecast. Search teams had good visibility for the first week. I thanked her and signed off. The light was almost gone now, the clearing a patchwork of gray and shadow. I started the ute and turned on the headlights, aiming them at the tent. The yellow fabric glowed in the beams, bright and clean, no sign of 11 years weathering or rot. I sat there with the engine idling, watching the tent, waiting for something to move or change. Nothing did. At 17:15, Alice radioed to say the sergeant had been delayed. Rock slide on the access road. ETA now 1900. I acknowledged and asked if she wanted me to stay on site. She said affirmative. Protocol required someone maintain visual contact until police arrival. I said copy and settled in to wait. The temperature gauge on the dash read 2 degrees and dropping. I killed the headlights to save the battery, and sat in the dark, the tent a pale shape against the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked under the weight of snow. The sound echoed across the clearing and faded into silence. I reached for the thermos I'd packed that morning and poured a cup of tea, holding it between my hands for warmth. The steam rose in the cold air, twisting and dissipating. When I looked up, the tent was still there, exactly where it had been. But now, in the last of the twilight, I could see something I hadn't noticed before. A second set of boot prints, leading away from the tent toward the tree line. I climbed out of the ute, leaving the door open and the cabin light on. The cold hit me immediately, a sharp edge that cut through my jacket and settled in my chest. The boot prints were clear in the snow, heading away from the tent in a straight line toward the dense timber on the eastern edge of the clearing. I followed them slowly, using my torch to track the depressions. They were fresh, the edges still crisp, not yet softened by wind or temperature change. Whoever had made them had walked this way in the last few hours, maybe less. The prints led about 20 meters into the trees, then stopped. Not at a tree or a rock or any natural barrier. They just stopped, mid-stride, as if the person had simply ceased to exist. I swept the torch across the ground in a wide arc, looking for where the trail picked up again. Nothing. The snow beyond was unmarked, smooth and undisturbed all the way to the next line of trees. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence. The wind had died completely, and the forest felt suspended, waiting. I turned and walked back to the tent, checking the ground as I went. The original set of prints, the ones leading to the tent from the south, were still there, but now, in better light, I could see they didn't match the ones heading into the trees. The first set was a size 10 or 11, the tread pattern, a common hiking boot, deep and evenly spaced. The second set was smaller, maybe a 9, and the tread was different, more worn, the lugs shallow and nearly smooth in places. 2 people. Or, the same person in different boots, 11 years apart. I keyed the radio and called Alice. She answered on the second try, her voice thin with static. I told her about the second set of prints and asked if the search file mentioned what kind of boots Garrett had been wearing. She said she'd check and get back to me. I clipped the radio to my belt and turned back to the tent. The zipper was still half open, the dark interior visible in the torchlight. I knew I shouldn't go inside, protocol was clear, but standing out here in the growing dark with 2 sets of prints, and no explanation, felt worse than bending the rules. I crouched at the entrance, and pulled the flap wider, shining the torch into the space. The camp stove was cold now, the fuel canister sitting beside it, nearly full. The sleeping bag was unrolled on the left side, the fabric smooth and undisturbed, no sign anyone had slept in it recently. On the right side, a pile of gear was stacked neatly against the tent wall, a pack, a water bottle, a small cook set, and a bundle of clothing tied with cord. I reached in and pulled the pack toward me, careful not to disturb the rest. It was a faded green day pack, the kind you'd use for short hikes, the straps frayed, and the fabric sun-bleached. I opened the top flap and looked inside. A map, folded and refolded so many times the creases had torn through. A compass, the brass casing tarnished. A small first aid kit, the plastic case cracked. And beneath it all, a journal, the cover stained and warped from moisture. I lifted it out and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and careful, the ink faded but legible. The name on the inside cover read Michael Garrett, and below it, a date, July 2013. I flipped through the pages slowly, reading the entries by torchlight. Most of it was standard hiking notes, weather observations, trail conditions, the names of peaks he'd summited. The tone was calm and methodical, the writing of someone who knew the country and respected it. But toward the end, the entries changed. The handwriting grew hurried, the sentences shorter, the observations less about the landscape, and more about something else. July 23rd, found a campsite near Granite Creek, looked abandoned, but the coals were still warm. No sign of anyone nearby. Left it alone and moved on. July 25th, same campsite, 3 kilometers west of where I saw it 2 days ago. That's not possible. Checked the map twice, I'm not lost. July 27th, it's following me. The campsite is here again. Same tent, same gear, but the location keeps changing. I'm not imagining this. The cold is worse at night now, even inside my sleeping bag. It doesn't feel like weather. July 29th, I think I'm going in circles. The peaks don't line up with the map anymore. I tried to head down this morning, but the trail led me back here. Someone else was here last night. I heard them moving around outside, but when I looked, there was no one. Just tracks in the snow, heading into the trees and stopping. The last entry was dated July 31st, 2 days before the search teams found his gear scattered across a ridgeline 15 kilometers south. It was a single sentence written in a shaking hand. "The cold follows, and the tent is never where you left it." I closed the journal and sat back on my heels, my breath misting in the freezing air. The radio crackled on my belt and Alice's voice came through, distant and broken by static. She said the file listed Garrett's boots as size 10, Salomon trail runners, gray and black. I thanked her and asked if there was any mention of a second person or second set of tracks during the search. She said negative. All evidence pointed to a solo hike, no signs of company or foul play. I signed off and clipped the radio back to my belt. The torch beam wavered across the tent floor, catching the edge of something metallic under the sleeping bag. I reached in and pulled it free. A compass, identical to the one in Garrett's pack. But this one was new, the brass still bright, the markings sharp and clear. I turned it over in my hand. On the back, engraved in small letters, M. Chen, 2019. I dropped it like it had burned me. The temperature in the clearing had fallen another few degrees, and the wind was starting to pick up again, rattling the branches overhead. I stood and backed away from the tent, scanning the tree line with the torch. Nothing moved. The snow was smooth and unbroken, except for my own tracks and the two sets leading to and from the tent. I walked back to the ute and climbed inside, pulling the door shut and locking it. The cabin light stayed on, casting a pale glow across the dashboard. I set the journal and the compass on the passenger seat and sat there, hands on the wheel, trying to think it through. Two people, 11 years apart, same tent, same clearing, both leaving tracks that led nowhere. And now me, sitting here at dusk with the temperature dropping and a storm moving in, waiting for a sergeant who might not make it through before the roads closed. The radio crackled again, and this time it was the sergeant himself, his voice tight and professional. He said the access road was blocked, crew estimated 4 hours minimum to clear it, and with the weather turning he couldn't guarantee arrival tonight. He asked if I could hold position until morning. I looked at the tent, pale and still in the growing dark. I said I'd stay, signed off, and turned the ute's engine back on to keep the heater running. Outside, the first flakes of new snow began to fall, drifting past the windscreen in slow spirals. And somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of a tent zipper opening, clear and deliberate in the cold air. I cut the engine and sat in the silence, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the soft hiss of snow against glass. The temperature gauge on the dashboard read -4 and dropping. Through the windscreen I could see the tent, its outline softening under the fresh fall, the pale fabric glowing faintly in the last of the twilight. The sound I'd heard, the zipper, had stopped as suddenly as it started, leaving only wind and the creak of branches overhead. I reached for the radio and keyed the mic. Kath answered within seconds, her voice steady through the static. I asked if there were any other crews within range of the clearing, anyone who might have accessed the site from a different trail. She said negative. I was the only ranger on patrol in this sector, and the police wouldn't attempt the access road until morning. I thanked her and asked her to log the time and weather conditions, then signed off. The journal sat on the passenger seat beside me, spine cracked and pages worn. I picked it up and flipped back to the entries I'd skimmed earlier, the ones where Garrett described his first days on the trail, his optimism about the snow conditions, and the clarity of the high country in winter. Then I found the page where the tone shifted. It was dated 6 days into his hike. The handwriting was still neat, but the words carried an edge I hadn't caught the first time. He wrote about waking in the night to find his tent had moved, not far, maybe 10 meters from where he'd pitched it, but enough that his boot prints in the snow led to empty, dizzy ground, and the tent now sat in a different clearing. He wrote it off as disorientation, a trick of the terrain in moonlight. But the next entry, dated 2 days later, described it happening again. This time, he'd marked his site with a cairn, 3 rocks stacked beside the entrance. When he woke at dawn, the cairn was gone, and his tent sat beside a stand of snow gums he didn't recognize. His tracks still led to the original site, but the tent wasn't there. After that, the entries became shorter, more fragmented. He mentioned the cold that didn't match the forecast, the way the wind seemed to follow him instead of blowing past, and the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the firelight each night. On the second-to-last page, he wrote about finding another campsite, older than his own, with gear he didn't recognize, and a name stitched into a pack, E. Rossi, 1998. He spent 2 days searching for Rossi, thinking maybe someone else was out there, lost or injured. But he found nothing, just tracks that circled back to the same clearing over and over, always leading to the tent, and never away. The final entry was half a sentence, written in a hand that looked hurried, almost frantic. It said, "The cold follows because it's already here, it doesn't need to," and then nothing. The rest of the page was blank. I closed the journal and set it back on the seat, then looked out at the clearing. The snow was falling heavier now, fat flakes that clung to the windscreen and blurred the tree line into a wall of white and shadow. The tent was barely visible, just a vague shape in the growing dark. I checked my watch. 17:40. Full dark in less than 20 minutes, and the storm wasn't going to ease before midnight at the earliest. I had 3 choices. I could stay in the ute, run the heater through the night and hope the fuel lasted until morning. I could attempt the descent now, in near whiteout conditions, and risk going off trail or losing the road entirely. Or I could move into the tent, use Garrett's gear to stay warm, and wait for first light when visibility would improve and the police could reach the site. The first option was safest in theory, but the ute's tank was under half and I didn't know how long the storm would hold. If the fuel ran out, I'd be sitting in a metal box at -10 with no heat and no way to call for help if the radio failed. The second option was a gamble I wasn't willing to take. Not in these conditions, not alone. That left the tent. I sat there for another 5 minutes, watching the snow pile against the base of the gum trees, then made the call. I grabbed my pack from the rear seat, checked the torch and pulled my beanie down over my ears. The cold hit me the moment I opened the door, a sharp edge that bit through my jacket and turned my breath to fog. I locked the ute and started across the clearing, boots sinking into the fresh snow with each step. The tent looked smaller up close, its fly sheet taut and unstained, despite the years. I crouched beside the entrance and listened. Nothing but wind and the faint rustle of fabric. I unzipped the fly and directed the torch inside. The interior was exactly as I'd left it. Sleeping bag smooth flat, stove cold and packed, journal and compass gone, because I'd taken them. I crawled in and pulled my pack after me, then zipped the entrance shut and sealed the vestibule. The temperature inside was only fractionally warmer than outside, maybe a degree or two, but the wind was gone, and the walls cut the worst of the chill. I lit the stove, Garrett's stove, and set a billy of snow on top to melt for water. The blue flame flickered and settled, casting soft shadows across the nylon walls. I arranged my sleeping bag beside Garrett's and sat cross-legged between them, hands held over the stove for warmth. The tent smelled faintly of canvas and cold earth, nothing rotten or stale, just the clean scent of high country air. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling through the gums and rattling the tent pegs. I checked the guy ropes by torchlight, making sure everything was secure, then settled back and waited for the water to boil. That's when I noticed the first anomaly. The sleeping bag beside me, the one I knew was Garrett's, had shifted. Not much, maybe 10 centimeters, but enough that it now lay partially unrolled, as though someone had started to climb inside and then stopped. I hadn't touched it since entering the tent. I stared at it for a long moment, then reached out and pressed my hand against the fabric. It was cold, the same temperature as everything else, but the surface felt wrong, too smooth, like it had been used recently and not left to stiffen in the freeze. I pulled my hand back and turned my attention to the stove. The water was starting to steam, small wisps curling up into the tent's apex. I added a tea bag from my pack and let it steep, then poured half into my mug and set the rest aside. The warmth felt good against my palms, and I drank slowly, trying to settle my nerves. The wind outside shifted direction, and for a moment the tent walls bellied inward, pressing close before snapping back. I heard something then, faint and rhythmic, like footsteps crunching through snow. I set the mug down and grabbed the torch, aiming the beam at the tent's entrance. The fabric was still, the zipper closed. The sound continued, circling the tent in a slow, deliberate loop. One pass, then another, always the same distance out, never coming closer or moving away. I called out, my voice rough in the enclosed space. No answer. The footsteps stopped. I waited, torch steady on the entrance, counting my breaths. 10 seconds. 20. Then the cold hit, not from outside but from within the tent itself, a sudden drop that turned the air white with frost and made my teeth ache. The stove flame guttered and died, plunging the tent into darkness except for the narrow beam of the torch. And in that beam, lying beside my sleeping bag, where nothing had been a moment before, was a second compass. Brass, bright, markings sharp. I didn't pick it up. I left the torch on, aimed at the compass. My breath came short and fast, fogging the beam. The cold pressed in from all sides, not the clean bite of altitude but something heavier, something that made my chest feel tight. I reached for the stove, fumbling with numb fingers to relight it, but the igniter clicked uselessly and the fuel valve wouldn't turn. The metal had gone brittle, like it had been left out in winter for years instead of minutes. I pulled my sleeping bag up around my shoulders and tried to think. The compass lay there, identical to the one in my pocket, and I knew without checking that if I looked at mine it would show the same impossibility, north rotating slowly, never settling. The footsteps hadn't returned, but the silence that replaced them felt worse, expectant. I checked my watch. 9:30. 6 hours until first light, maybe 7 before I'd have enough visibility to risk the descent, even in clear weather. The storm outside showed no sign of easing, wind still hammering the tent walls and snow hissing against the fabric. The journal lay beside my pack where I'd left it. I picked it up, turned to the last entry, read it again by torchlight. Garrett's handwriting, rushed but legible. The cold follows. Doesn't matter where you go in the tent, it finds you. Heard Jane last night, her voice calling from outside, but Jane's been dead 3 years. Don't think I'm getting out this time. If someone finds this, asterisk. And there the entry stopped, mid-sentence, the pen trailing off the page. I flipped back through earlier pages, looking for something I'd missed. The entries grew more frantic as they progressed, Garrett describing the same phenomena I was experiencing now. The cold spots. The sounds. The way the tent seemed to shift position overnight, even when staked down. He'd mentioned others too, names I didn't recognize, all of them winter hikers who'd vanished in the high country over the past 40 years. One passage made me stop. Smikers Point Pavka, found Marchetti's old pack today, the one from Payski à la Sea, rations still sealed, sleeping bag looked new. Don't know how that's possible. Tried to leave it, take only what I needed, but when I woke this morning my gear was mixed with his and I couldn't tell which was which anymore. Wokte pitogistais. I looked around the tent. My pack sat against the wall, red fabric distinct in the torchlight. Next to it was a blue pack I'd assumed was Garrett's. But beside that, half buried under the loose tarp, I could see a third, olive drab, military surplus, the kind they stopped making decades ago. I hadn't noticed it before. The cold intensified, and I heard a new sound, not footsteps but something softer, fabric rustling. The sleeping bag next to mine was moving. Not much, just a subtle shift, the kind a person makes when settling in for the night. I aimed the torch at it and watched the surface ripple once, then go still. My radio sat useless in my lap, dead since 6 o'clock. The emergency beacon was in my pack, but activating it now meant committing to evacuation, meant someone would have to come up in this storm to pull me out. I wasn't sure I wanted to do that, wasn't sure I could explain what was happening in any way that made sense. The temperature kept dropping. I could see my breath now, even inside the sleeping bag, thick plumes that hung in the air before fading. My fingers ached despite the gloves, and when I touched the tent wall the fabric felt like sheet metal, hard and cold enough to burn. The torch beam started to dim. I shook it, checked the batteries, but the light continued to fade until it was barely aglow. In the growing darkness I could make out shapes I hadn't seen before. More gear piled in the corners, sleeping bags and packs and equipment, all layered together like sediment. How many? I couldn't tell. The rustling came again, multiple sources this time, all around me. I pressed myself against the far wall of the tent, and tried to control my breathing. The cold was unbearable now, worse than anything I'd felt outside, and I realized with a sick certainty that Garrett had been right. The cold followed, it found you. And once it did, the tent became something else, somewhere else. I thought about making a run for it, tearing open the entrance and taking my chances with the storm, but I remembered the bootprints I'd seen that afternoon, the single trail leading in, with nothing leading out, and I knew that wouldn't work. Whatever was happening here didn't end when you left the tent. It just moved you somewhere new and started over. The torch died completely. In the absolute darkness I heard breathing, slow and steady, coming from the sleeping bag beside me. Then another source, farther away. Then a third. All of them matching rhythm, all of them too measured to be natural. I fumbled for the emergency beacon, found the activation switch, and hesitated. My hand hovered over it, shaking. If I pressed it now, would rescue find me here, Or would they find another empty campsite with my gear scattered among the others? Would I become another name in Garrett's journal, another hiker who vanished in the high country and reappeared in a tent that shouldn't exist? The breathing grew louder. I thought about Davies back at the station, about the search teams that would come looking, about how they'd find the same thing they'd found 11 years ago when Garrett disappeared. Tracks leading in, nothing leading out, and a campsite that felt wrong in ways no one could quite articulate. The cold reached a peak, then suddenly broke. Warmth flooded back into the tent, not gradually but all at once, like a switch had been thrown. The pressure in my chest eased, and I could breathe again. I dug out my spare torch, clicked it on, and the beam cut through the darkness, showing me the tent exactly as it had been when I'd entered hours ago. One sleeping bag beside mine, my pack against the wall, the stove cold but intact. No other gear, no other packs, no sign of the things I'd seen in the darkness. The breathing had stopped. I checked my watch, but the face was dark, hands frozen at 9:30. My phone showed no time, just a blank screen that wouldn't respond to any input. Outside, the wind had died to nothing, and the only sound was my own pulse hammering in my ears. I knew I couldn't stay, not for the rest of the night, not even another hour. The tent had let go of me for now, but I didn't trust it to stay that way, didn't trust that the cold wouldn't return or that next time I'd be able to tell what was real from what wasn't. I packed my gear in darkness, working by feel, making sure I took only what I'd brought in. The emergency beacon went into my jacket pocket, activated but not yet transmitting a distress signal. When everything was secured, I moved to the tent entrance, found the zipper and stopped. My hand rested on the pull. On the other side was a whiteout, sub-zero temperatures, and 3 kilometers of technical descent, in conditions that could kill me in a dozen different ways. But behind me was the tent, and the sleeping bag that had moved, and the breathing that hadn't been mine. I pulled the zipper down and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit like a fist. One step out of the tent, and I was in a world that had no memory of shelter, no concept of warmth, just wind, and darkness and snow that cut across exposed skin like broken glass. I couldn't see more than a meter in any direction. The torch beam died in the whiteout, swallowed by spinning white, and I clicked it off to save the battery for when it might actually help. Navigation by feel then, by memory, by the slope of the ground beneath my boots and the wind direction against my face. The emergency beacon sat heavy in my jacket pocket, transmitting now, a steady pulse that would bring help if I could stay alive long enough for them to reach me. 3 kilometers to the tree line, then another 2 down through snow gums to where the track widened and the risk of walking off a cliff edge dropped from certain to merely probable. I kept my breathing steady, counted steps, used my poles to probe the snow ahead before committing my weight. The storm had intensified in the hours I'd spent in the tent, or maybe time had worked differently in there and what I'd thought was half a night had been longer. My watch still showed nothing. The phone in my pack was just dead weight now. 20 minutes into the descent, I realized I couldn't feel my fingers properly through the gloves. 40 minutes and I'd lost the main track, was navigating by contour alone, trusting that if I kept the slope at the right angle, I'd hit the valley floor eventually. The wind screamed across exposed rock, and I pressed into what little shelter I could find, waited for the worst gusts to pass, then pushed on. I thought about Garrett doing this same descent 11 years ago, thought about him making it down or not making it down, thought about whether he'd ever left that tent at all or whether some part of him was still there, caught in whatever loop the high country had created around that campsite. The cold was different now, just ordinary winter cold, the kind that could harm you through exposure and time but didn't carry that deeper wrong feeling I'd experienced in the tent. I could work with ordinary cold. First light came slowly, gray bleeding into black at the edges of my vision until I could make out shapes in the snow, the dark line of a boulder field to my left, the gentler slope of the valley opening up ahead. The storm was easing, wind dropping from a scream to a steady push, visibility stretching from meters to tens of meters to something almost workable. I checked my position against the landscape, recognized the saddle between 2 peaks that marked the upper valley, and knew I'd drifted west but not dangerously so. Another hour brought me into the snow gums, where the wind broke against the canopy, and the snow lay thinner on the ground. I could move faster here, follow the natural line of the drainage, let gravity and familiarity guide me down. My radio crackled. The sound was so unexpected I stopped dead, pulled it from my jacket with clumsy fingers, pressed transmit. Nothing came out but static. I tried again, got the same white noise, then a fragment of voice, too distorted to make out words, then silence. But it meant I was back in range, back in a part of the mountains where radios worked, and help existed, and the normal rules applied. I kept moving. The track widened, the gradient eased, and by mid-morning I stumbled onto the fire trail that led back to the Gothega station. My legs were shaking, my core temperature was dropping despite the exertion, and when I finally saw the station buildings through the trees, I wanted to sit down right there and not move for a week. Davies met me at the door, took one look at my face and guided me inside without questions. Hot tea first, then the thermal blanket, then the questions. I told him everything while my hands thawed around the mug, told him about the tent, and the journal, and the cold that wasn't natural, and the breathing in the darkness, and the decision to walk out in a whiteout, rather than stay another hour in that place. He listened without interrupting, made notes, didn't tell me I was wrong or mistaken, or suffering from exposure-induced confusion. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Police are on their way," he said finally. "Choppers grounded until the weather clears, so they're coming up by road. Should be here by afternoon." I nodded, sipped the tea, felt warmth spreading through my chest but couldn't shake the cold that seemed to have settled deeper than muscle and bone. "The beacon coordinates," I said. "You got them?" Davies checked his log, read them back to me. I recognized them, the spot where I'd pitched my tent beside Garrett's, the small flat area below the ridgeline, with good drainage, and some shelter from the worst wind. "That's it," I said. The police arrived at 3, 2 officers from Jindabyne and a search coordinator I'd worked with before on lost hiker callouts. They took my statement, asked careful questions about timeline and conditions, and what I'd actually seen versus what I'd felt or suspected. I gave them the coordinates again, showed them the photos I'd taken on my phone before the battery died, described the tent and the gear and the journal entries. They were professional, thorough, gave nothing away in their expressions. At first light the next day they went up, a team of 4 with me staying behind at the station, because I was still recovering from the exposure and because no one thought putting me back at that site was a good idea. I watched the weather reports, tracked their progress on the radio, waited for confirmation that they'd found it, that the tent was still there and I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The call came through just before noon. Davies took it, listened, asked 2 short questions, then signed off and turned to me with an expression I couldn't read. "They're at your coordinates," he said. "Undisturbed snow. No tent, no campsite, no tracks. Just fresh powder over bare ground like nothing's been there all season." I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like excuses or madness. "They're doing a grid search of the immediate area," Davies continued. "But the coordinator says if there was a tent there recently, there'd be some trace. Compacted snow, disturbed ground, something." I nodded, finished my tea, stared out the window at the high country, rising white and implacable beyond the valley. That evening I wrote up my incident report, kept it factual, included everything I could document, and noted where my observations became subjective. I mentioned Garrett's journal but couldn't produce it, mentioned the gear I'd photographed but the images hadn't survived whatever had happened to my phone. The report went into the system, and I knew how it would read, knew what conclusions would be drawn. A ranger, alone at altitude in deteriorating conditions, experiencing stress and possible early-stage hypothermia, reporting phenomena that couldn't be verified. Not a lie, but not the truth either, not the whole truth. 3 days later I was back on regular patrols, different sectors, nothing that took me above the tree line, or into the area where I'd found the tent. The winter permit system flagged no anomalies, no names that didn't match records, no Michael Garretts applying for solo winter hikes. The police investigation stayed open but inactive, one of those files that sits on a desk waiting for new information that never comes. I thought about Garrett's journal, about the names he'd recorded, about the question he'd asked. How many times does a person have to vanish before they're really gone? I thought about cycles and loops and places where the high country folded back on itself in ways that had nothing to do with geography, and everything to do with something older and colder than human understanding. Now when I process winter permits I look at them twice, check the dates, make sure I recognize the names. And I tell everyone the same thing. If you're going up in winter, file your route plan, take a beacon, and if you find a campsite that feels wrong, if you find gear that shouldn't be there, or a tent that doesn't match the season or the permit records, you walk away. You don't investigate, you don't shelter there, you just mark the coordinates, and you leave. Because some parts of the high country don't follow the rules we understand, and some cold isn't meant to be survived. If you've driven the Alpine Way at night, you know the silence, the way the mountains rise black against the stars and the road drops away into nothing. Hit like and subscribe. More stories are coming.